All right, so hello and welcome to our live virtual presentation. This is presented by the Howell Carnegie District Library and the League of Women Voters of Livingston County. My name is Jamie and I'm going to be your tech coordinator this evening. Thank you for joining us all. I have just a couple housekeeping items to go over before we get started. Tonight's presentation is scheduled to run until 8 p.m. We'll begin with a presentation by our speaker, followed by time for questions. To reduce distractions during the presentation, all attendees will be muted. You are still welcome to share your questions in the chat and encouraged to share your questions in the chat. Those will be addressed at the end during our Q&A session. Also, during the Q&A session, if you have any questions at that point, you can still let us know in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function to let us know that you have a question and we will unmute you. This program does have subtitles enabled. If you do not like them, you are welcome to turn them off. Down at the bottom, there's a live transcript option. It has a little arrow in the corner. If you click that, you can turn those off. This program is also being recorded. It will be available on the library's YouTube channel shortly after this program. If you do not want your video to appear, make sure that your video is turned off, that there is a little slash over the camera icon at the bottom there. So that is it for the housekeeping items. Without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Ellen Lafferty, who is the chairperson of our local League of Women Voters of Livingston County.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight so much. For those of us who are new to our public forums, the League of Women Voters is proud to be nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government, but always working on vital issues of concern to voters here in our county. Please consider joining the League of Women Voters of Livingston County through our website, which is a beautiful website. We are a nonprofit group that is dependent on individual memberships and donations to the League in order to be able to provide you evenings such as this to Livingston County residents. Our next public event for the League will be on Tuesday, November 16th, starting at 7 p.m., where we will be presenting Making Democracy Work, an educational evening focusing on voting rights. We will be providing updates on recently passed legislation, voting bills in committee at the state and federal level, and current initiatives in the works. We'll also be sharing the highlights of the Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson's legislative agenda. The League of Women Voters of Livingston County, along with other leagues across the state, are working hard to educate voters on the safety and security of our elections. Please join us for this educational evening. Registration for this event is available right now, through the Howell Library's website. I want to take a quick moment to thank Howell Carnegie Library and tonight's host, Jamie Perdue, for making this virtual program available to us this evening. We are extremely fortunate to partner with all the local libraries in the Livingston County community. And now I'd like to turn this over to our League co-host, Claire Donovan, who will introduce our special guests for this evening. Thank you, Claire.
Yep, good evening, everybody. We're really excited this evening to hear from some of us, our Indigenous members of the state, and how policy has affected people in the different tribes. So first of all, we really would like to thank Amber Neely, who is our Indigenous representative here this evening, who you will probably hear the most from. Amber is a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, and Amber's going to have a real blast at watching me try to pronounce her native name. Located in Michigan Upper Peninsula. Her Anishinaabe name, do you want to help me, Amber?
It's Anamiki Nabikawagan Ikwe.
It translates to Thunderbird Necklace Woman. An inspiring Indigenous civil rights and environmental justice attorney, Amber is a third-year law student at Wayne State University Law School, studying constitutional law American Indian law, environmental law, and civil rights. Our goal this evening was to focus on the government laws and policies that have affected our Indigenous people in our state. I'm really excited to hear from Amber. Also this evening, we have Deb Netto from the Great Lakes Peace Center and Kathy Vanden Bogaert. How'd I do, Kathy?
Pretty good.
All right, all right.
Hello,
So,
everybody. Yes, we're just going to get to it if that's all right, Claire.
we're ready.
Awesome.
And
I'm Deb Netto with the Great Lakes Peace Center in Rapid River, Michigan.
And I'm Kathy Vanden Bogaert.
We're a small grassroots organization that's focused on really honoring diversity and building peace in our communities across Michigan. We're honored to be here. Thank you so much. And we are going to have Q&A in the last, hopefully 10 to 15 minutes. So please put your questions in the chat and we will answer those questions at the end of our presentation. Thank you very much. And Amber, it's all yours.
Okay, we've got my screen shared, right?
Yes, it looks good, Amber.
Okay, great. I'm going to do my best to be on full screen. I might have to exit out if I need to see my notes. So we're going to start tonight with the League of Women Voters Land Acknowledgement. Livingston County occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi. The League of Women Voters recognizes that Anishinaabe of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ottawa, Ojibwa, also Chippewa, and Potawatomi, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. Livingston County occupies land ceded in the 1807 Treaty of Detroit. Let's see. I'm not sure what's going on here. Okay, so a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous people as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. Knowing where we live and work does not change the past, but understanding and acknowledging the history, culture, and impacts of colonialism is a crucial step toward the creation of an equitable and sustainable future. To recognize the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land since time immemorial. Some tips for creating a land acknowledgement of your own are to use the wonderful resource native-land.ca to find which tribe or tribe's land you want to acknowledge. And if welcomed, to consult a tribal elder from the place you are acknowledging. A tip for this is to just Google the tribe that you're looking for. Tribes are their own governments and communities, and a big majority of them just have websites nowadays where you can go and look up contact information there. You always want to consider who the land acknowledgement is really for and what its true purpose is. I like to say that the land acknowledgement, the purpose is really to do some truth telling about colonialism, and it's not necessarily for the tribe, if that makes sense. And we always want to avoid tokenism. It's important to really do a bit of research on what specific tribe you need to acknowledge, and just recognize that tribal people are not a monolith. And our topic for tonight, the Discovery Doctrine, that is the Doctrine of Discovery and its present day consequences. I'm starting with this timeline just to kind of orient the time periods that we're going to be discussing. We'll move through these mostly sequentially, but sometimes kind of skipping back because a lot of these things were happening on top of the other. So in the 15th century, colonialists asked the Pope to justify their conquistadors' taking of indigenous lands by force in North America. Pope Alexander VI issued a public decree establishing the Doctrine of Discovery, which dismissed indigenous tribal nations as subhuman, calling them, quote, not human or Christian. The Pope's decree assigned Catholic kings the alleged right to claim any lands not owned by another Christian. And the discovery doctrine really provided a false claim to tribal lands that was based in colonialist greed and white supremacy under the veil of it being God's will. Here I have a slide about the crime of genocide, just defining that crime. It includes these acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group's conditions of life, calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and transferring children of the group to another group. Throughout history of Native American genocide, it is estimated that 80 to 95% of the indigenous population was displaced to make room for the United States. Natives were killed, starved, had their children taken away, their homes burned, their land taken away. And this brutal history has been whitewashed in education, and throughout history, indigenous people have been cast as beasts, as savages, and inhuman. Some accounts of the American Revolution allege that enslaved tribes were forced to fight for the American or British, casting indigenous people on either side of a war being fought over their land. Egregious human rights have been violated to handle what became known as the Indian problem in America. Anishinaabe is the Anishinaabe people's word for land, for the world. And if you were here in 1817, Michigan would have seemed an entirely indigenous space. It was dominated by Native people who lived in Detroit, Mackinac, in the Grand River Valley, and in the Upper Peninsula. And anywhere you went, you would have encountered Native people, and it would have been Native people continuing to live as their ancestors had done. That's from historian Michael Witkin of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Just checking in on our timeline. And our first Supreme Court case that we will discuss, Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823. This case established that the federal government had the sole right of negotiation with Native nations. That means that a Native nation was not allowed to sell their land to anyone but the federal government, and they needed the United States permission to sell the land. The case involved a land title dispute between two white men. The Johnson plaintiffs claimed a right to lands in Indiana and Illinois. Their interest derived from a sale by the Piankashaw Indians. And on the defendant's side, the McIntosh defendants claimed lands in Indiana that were possibly in conflict with the plaintiff's land, but perhaps not. There is history out there that says that it wasn't even actually the same piece of land. It was just that the government was trying to set this precedent. The defendants claim to have acquired the land from the United States, who got it from a group of Indians from the Illinois Confederacy. And in this case, Chief Justice Marshall from the United States Supreme Court cited the Doctrine of Discovery to rule that American Indians did not own their land. Justice Marshall upheld the British defendant McIntosh's claim to the land, reasoning that since the federal government now controls the land, the Indians had only a so-called right to occupancy and held no actual title in the land. This is known as Indian title. The court acknowledged that this practice treated Native Americans as, quote, an inferior race of people without the privileges of citizens and under the perpetual protection and pupillage of the government. A quote in the case from Chief Justice, he said, the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. And this case really infiltrates American property law even up until today. This concept of Indian title, where the title could only be divested by purchase or conquest by the United States, and title to the land lay with its discoverer. This was originally supposed to mean that Native nations retained their inherent sovereignty and retained domain over their lands over discovery. So they were supposed to not only be allowed to stay, but retain their sovereignty. However, the Indian Removal Act followed and further limits on tribal sovereignty that we will discuss shortly. The Indian Removal Act followed just a few years after the Johnson v. McIntosh cases, and this included just horrible incidents of Indian removal, including the Trail of Tears. Passed by Congress in 1830, the Trail of Tears was part of a series of forced displacements of approximately 60,000 Native Americans between 1830 and 1850. And this idea of manifest destiny came about around 1845. The coin was termed for the idea that the United States was destined by God and its advocates believed to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. Indian removal continued into the 20th century. Wounded Knee, located on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, was the site of two conflicts between American Indians and the U.S. government. The 1890 massacre by the U.S. 7th Cavalry left 300 Sioux dead. And in 1975, 2 FBI agents and a Native man were killed in a shootout between federal agents and the American Indian Movement, or AIM. In the trial that followed, AIM member Leonard Peltier was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. And this is a very controversial ruling. If you want to know more about this, I would definitely look it up. And just a fun pop culture fact is the band Rage Against the Machine, their music video Freedom is actually about this incident, this shootout with the FBI agents at the Pine Ridge Reservation. Right here in Michigan, we had the Burt Lake Burnout in 1900. On October 15th, 1900, the Sheboyganing band of Indians were forced off land that they had legally purchased. And what happened was, in the late 1800s, Sheboygan County, Michigan officials improperly assessed taxes on tribal land where they didn't actually owe any taxes, and the tribe refused to pay. Then the land went into foreclosure improperly. The band refused to pay, and the Sheboygan County Sheriff, Fred Ming, led a confrontation along with a land speculator. The men ordered the women and children out of their cabins, tossed their belongings out into the road, and set their homes on fire, The stories say that the men of Indian Village were gone the day of the Burt Lake burnout. And now the area is private property dotted with multi-million-dollar vacation homes along the water. And this quote is from descendants of the Sheboyganing band. They said, when McGinn took his men in there and burnt down that village, they didn't burn down the church because, that would be wrong. Now, while all of this removal was going on throughout the 1800s and into 1900, there was all along the way at the same time removal of Indian children. So starting back as early as 1618, the Anglican Church sanctioned the Virginia colony to attempt assimilation of local natives through education. The Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania opened in 1879. This was the first government-run boarding school for Indian children. The goal was forced assimilation of Native children into white society under the belief of kill the Indian, save the man. This was run by U.S. Cavalry Captain Richard Henry Platt, and he ran the boarding schools similar to his military operations. Here in Michigan, we had the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School that operated between 1893 and 1933. Each year, the school enrolled approximately 150 girls and 175 boys from Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes, ranging in age from kindergarten to 8th grade. Like other boarding schools operating across the country at this time, students were stripped of their Indigenous culture, their language, family, community, hair, and clothing. Children were punished and abused. It's estimated that approximately 2,000 children lost their lives here. And this is in the broader context of 367 schools across the United States, with some of them actually still operating today. A wonderful resource on this topic is the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, or NABS. They do some wonderful truth and healing work, and they're just a fantastic resource for boarding school trauma. Between 25 and 35% of Indian children were removed from their homes and placed for adoption with non-Indian families. Coerced closed adoption, some with no paperwork, were common. And of those removed children, up to 90% were placed with families outside of their tribal communities, regardless of whether there were relatives able to care for the children. The removal of Native children was based on a federal government assumption that Native families were unfit to care for Native children. And in 1978, so we're talking 155 years after Chief Justice Marshall cited the Discovery Doctrine in Johnson McIntosh, we have the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, that Congress passed in 1978. It was passed in response to the alarmingly high number of Indian children being removed from their homes. The intent of Congress under ICWA was to protect the best interests of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families. Before ICWA, Indian parents were not entitled to notice of a removal or adoption proceeding of their own child to an attorney or to really any meaningful opportunity to be heard. In fact, in some places, Indians were not allowed to testify in court. Before ICWA, social workers imposed their cultural beliefs on Indian families without any understanding of the differences. And there were just biases where Indian parents were accused of neglect for things that lots of parents do, like dropping the kids off at grandma's house when both mom and dad had to go to work. When Indian parents were accused of neglect, they had little to no recourse to overcome that assumption. So ICWA applies to child custody matters involving Indian children, including removals and adoptions. The law has given Indigenous parents rights that they did not have before, including that their parental rights may not be terminated unless the state proves it is in the best interest of the Indian child. The state shows it has provided active efforts to seek reunification of the Indian family, and Indian parental rights may not be terminated unless the court hears testimony from a qualified expert witness. Even with ICWA, Indian children are still removed more than any other group. Nationwide, Native children are 3 times more likely than white children to be in foster care. In South Dakota, that statistic is 9 times more likely to be in foster care. And in Minnesota, Native children are 20 times more likely to be in foster care than white children. ICWA is under attack. Challenges to ICWA come from parents who want to adopt and states who claim the law is in violation of the equal protection clauses of the Constitution, among other claims. The equal protection claims allege that since Indian families are given preference for Indian children, that this unfairly discriminates against non-Indian families seeking to adopt children. So this is kind of a reverse racism argument. In the current case, Brackeen v. Holland, the plaintiffs are foster and adoptive parents, and the states of Texas, Louisiana, and Indiana. This case is currently up for review by the Supreme Court. In Brackeen v. Holland, the parents, the Brackeen family, sought to adopt Indian children. And what's really interesting about this case is the states also being plaintiffs, the states Texas, Louisiana, Indiana, and Ohio. These are home to only about 1% of the total number of federally recognized Indian tribes and less than 4% of the national American Indian and Alaska Native population. But these states with so few indigenous people view ICWA as offensive to their sovereignty. And on the other hand, the 27 states, which are collectively home to 94% of Indian tribes and 69% of the total indigenous population, these states have actually asked the courts to uphold ICWA, and they view ICWA as a critical tool in managing their relationships with Indian tribes within their borders. The consequences of Indian children being placed with non-Indian in non-Indian homes are vast. Indian children who are placed in non-Indian settings suffer consequences when they come into adolescence and as adults. They have difficulty in education, in work, and in interpersonal relationships because they don't feel like they fit in either place. And John Echohawk of the Native American Rights Fund said, "We've just seen so many instances over the years where Indian children have basically come to discover that they are really tribal members, but they never knew that before. And the reason they didn't is because the Indian Child Welfare Act was not applied to them. It did not protect them." So I'll just pause right here and say that if the Supreme Court decides not to hear the Brackeen case, that would be actually the best case scenario for Indigenous people, because it would mean that ICWA would stay intact, at least for now. So moving right along, our next Supreme Court decision that we're going to discuss also happened in 1978. We're 155 years out from the Supreme Court citing the Doctrine of Discovery. And this is the case Oliphant v. Suquamish Indian Tribe. This involved Oliphant. He was a teenager who was arrested for assaulting a tribal police officer and resisting arrest on the Port Madison Reservation. Oliphant challenged the tribe's jurisdiction, asserting that since he was not a tribal member, he was not under its jurisdiction. And the court here cited an unspoken assumption by the United States that tribes never possessed this power. The holding of the case was that Indian tribes do not possess criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. The present day, one of many present day implications of this ruling is missing and murdered Indigenous women. Native American women face disproportionately high rates of disappearance, rape, and murder across the United States. Under the Oliphant precedent, non-Native men who assault Native women cannot be arrested or prosecuted by tribal authorities. Instead, victims' families must wait for the federal government to prosecute perpetrators. In most cases, federal prosecutors decline to prosecute the cases referred to them, and most cases go unsolved. When pipeline construction occurs near reservations, First Nations communities face not only the threat of the extraction industry's environmental and economic impacts, but also the threat of violence against women. Pipeline sites bring thousands of highly paid temporary workers who have no social connection with the rural tribal communities bordering their company-owned housing units. And the already disproportionately high rates of disappearance, rape, and murder among Indigenous women have surged alongside extractive fossil fuel infrastructure. The case of Olivia Lone Bear involved a mother of 5 who in 2017 went missing from the Fort Berthold Reservation near the Bakken Oil Shale, the access site for the Dakota Access Pipeline. Her family urged the FBI to search the lake near her house for almost a year. And when they finally did, they did find her. She was buckled into the passenger side seat belt in her truck and submerged in the lake, right near where the family had wanted search. The FBI called this a suicide. And this brings up kind of a newer phrase that is out there known as missing white woman syndrome, when Black, Brown, and Indigenous women are ignored. There's a huge disparity between how the FBI behaves when a white woman goes missing and how the FBI behaves when a Native woman goes missing. The majority of violent crimes against Indians are committed by non-Indians, and Native American women are more likely than any other group to go missing. It's estimated that 64,000 Black women and girls are currently missing in the United States, and in Wyoming alone, at least 710 Indigenous people were reported missing in about the last decade. Secretary Deb Haaland, the United States Secretary of the Interior, said, "Where I can make a difference in particular is in addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis, which has occurred since the beginning of colonization of Indigenous people on this continent for about the last 500 years, and it continues." So the last Supreme Court decision I'm going to talk about tonight is Montana v. United States. This was just a few years after Oliphant, and similar to the reduction in sovereignty for Indians over non-Indians in the criminal sense, Montana did the same thing for civil jurisdiction over non-Indians. This case involved the Crow tribe of Montana, and relying on treaties that created its reservation and its inherent power as a sovereign, the Crow tribe sought to prohibit hunting and fishing by non-members of the tribe within reservation boundaries. Due to the federal government's allotment policies, almost 30% of the Crow Indians reservation in Montana was owned by non-Indians. And the Montana court followed the Oliphant decision to similarly limit tribes' civil jurisdiction over non-members, noting the general proposition that the inherent sovereign powers of an Indian tribe do not extend to the activities of non-members of the tribe. And I'm just going to pause here to have you consider how that would ever look if a state didn't have jurisdiction over people coming from out of state, because it just would never happen. There are some exceptions to this general proposition. One is that the non-member consents to tribal jurisdiction. So somebody, a company, for example, doing business on a reservation can consent to tribal jurisdiction. And then the second exception is that the non-member activity threatens the political integrity, economic security, or health and welfare of the tribe and its members. Where this comes into play with our present day implications is just how hard Indigenous water protectors have to work to be even allowed to protect their own natural resources. This could be an entire presentation on its own. I'm just going to give you a few examples. It took the Keweenaw Indian community in the Upper Peninsula 7 years to get treatment as a state status under the Environmental Protection Agency to administer the Clean Water Act on its reservation. The Menominee tribe of Wisconsin had to fight hard for nearly a decade to protect the Menominee River from the proposed Aquila Back 40 open pit sulfide mine. And just a few notes here: Michigan tribes oppose Enbridge Line 3. line 5, excuse me, Minnesota tribes oppose and bridge line 3. And of course, Indigenous tribes out west oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline. I'm going to start wrapping it up. I'm sharing with you the 7 principles of Anishinaabe Madzowin. They are wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy.
Thanks, Amber.
Just one sec. This seems to happen. I'm not sure why. Okay.
Okay. So now that Amber has shared all of the information that that she did with us tonight, we want to switch a little bit into steps that you can take moving forward to support First Nations people. And so a lot of what Deb and I are going to be sharing with you comes from suggestions for Indigenous resources and from our Indigenous friends, as far as, you know, the things that they feel are most important that we as non-Native people can do to support our Indigenous neighbors. And so we're just going to go through this pretty quickly. We do have a handout that has more details that we can share with you, and we can talk later about the best way to do that. But one of the things that Amber had touched on earlier was to get into the habit of making tribal land and nation acknowledgements. And so some of the resources there she shared, and there's another resource that we have used from that has a land acknowledgement guide that kind of takes a step through things to consider as you're deciding what you want to include in a land acknowledgement. Another thing too is that it's our hope that this is the beginning of a meaningful journey in your community, and obviously this is a long list with lots of different suggestions, and we encourage you to just pick and choose whichever speak to you and you feel that you can focus on to at least start the process. And so one of the other suggestions that we want to share is to learn more and to learn the truth about the real history of the Anishinaabe people in our area throughout the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, as well as just the true history of our country since the beginning of European explorers. And so some of the suggestions are to read books by Indigenous authors, listen to TED Talks, watch documentaries, follow Indigenous groups on Facebook. There's the Native Land app that Amber mentioned that you can install right on your phone and use wherever you are in the country to find out who the original inhabitants of that land were. Another thing is to use your voice. A lot of times Indigenous people have been talked over and ignored. And so when we are in a situation where we can use our advantages to speak the truth and to support what we know and see, then it's helpful for us to be doing that. And to yield the floor when you're working with Indigenous people and other marginalized groups so that they have the opportunity to speak first and be heard before other voices jump into the conversation, because sometimes we do have a tendency to dominate those conversations. So let's see, become aware of stereotypes. I think, you know, a huge issue that continues to get a lot of attention in the media are mascot issues, from national sports teams all the way to high school teams, and how offensive that is to Indigenous communities, and that we need to be listening and doing what we can to be respectful of that. Share what you're learning find a way to talk to your children and grandchildren. Consider hosting discussions and dialogues like we are doing this evening to continue to learn more about that. Attend Indigenous events and other Indigenous gatherings. With COVID happening, a lot of things are being offered virtually, as far as powwows and other types of webinars and online gatherings. There's a powwow.com app that you can, or website that you can look up and find all sorts of information for things happening in your area. Also checking the websites of the specific tribes in your area for events and activities. There's always things going on that happen locally that you could become aware of just by checking out those sources. And then lastly, to advocate for, or actually, I've got a few more, don't I? For a more inclusive, truthful school curriculum. I don't know, but I'm guessing that many of you, like myself, didn't learn about any of this stuff in our history books when we were going to school, and so those are conversations that need to happen and need to change so that this information gets out and people are more aware of it. And then integrating history and culture in your daily lives. And one of the ways you can do that is by having conversations around specific holidays and observances. We just went through Indigenous Peoples Day versus Columbus Day and having conversations about that and why it's important to switch that focus from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Thanksgiving is coming up. Lots of opportunity to talk about the true history of what really happened compared to what we have been told and taught throughout our history and history books, I should say. And so I'm going to turn it over to Deb and let her continue with the other suggestions that we have.
So in supporting Indigenous friends, neighbors, we're asking people to consider consuming media and art created by Indigenous people. Each tribe, at least in our communities in the Upper Peninsula, have lists of their tribal members who own businesses. And we're asking people to consider hiring their services or purchasing their items. Join and support organizations advocating for Indigenous communities. We have a lot of organizations that your local Indigenous community can give you information on. I know with the Peace Center, we're always advocating for organizations and connecting the people up here to organizations. We've got some powerful Indigenous law groups. Stephen Newcomb, I'm thinking, and there's other groups that we could direct you to in our handout that we'd be happy to send and have it linked to this recording that has a list of those resources and even some lists of where to link with Indigenous authors. Supporting Indigenous issues. The cultural difference for what we've learned is that the Indigenous communities that we work with, our earth and all of creation are connected to us. We are all connected. And so they are very strong advocates for the protection of the land, the water, the animals, all beings. So supporting Indigenous issues when you're working with Indigenous communities. Up here, we're working with water protection, but we're also working on other issues. Each community is different. So it's really important to have a relationship with your Indigenous community. Again, they're sovereign nations. So you're really working with a different government and a different culture. Taking care, like I said, taking care of the environment. And Kathy had mentioned how we at the Peace Center, we yield the floor to our all Indigenous people within a meeting or at an event first, because their culture, when Amber shared those 7 grandfather teachings, those 7 truths, respect for them means being quiet and waiting for the proper opportunity. And culturally, I was born in 1960. So I am a very talkative person, and I will talk over all the Indigenous people in the room if I am not careful. And I still have people who remind me to be quiet and let the Indigenous people in the room speak, which is super important. It's a cultural difference. It's a show of respect, because we do, again, it's culture. It's not an arrogance thing. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a cultural difference. So what we're really, really hoping for with this presentation tonight is you heard of four cases of governmental policies that impact Indigenous people all the way to today. We want you to move forward in, and to support people moving forward in a good way. Our mission here in our small grassroots organization is building peace and celebrating diversity. We really believe it's one person at a time, and that we just move that ripple out. We are involved in very, very simple things like dedications of peace poles that involve all people in the community, including the Indigenous community. That's what we're advocating for. And as we know better and learn more about the true history of a country, we're asking people to do better. And that's, we're just honored that the League of Women Voters and the Howell Carnegie Library invited us tonight. I'm just going to end. We've got 10 minutes now for questions, but I want to tell you that we started the Peace Center because my husband, Brad Netto, is an Indigenous man who was and is an Indian boarding school survivor. And he lost his firstborn son to a forced removal, and his son was adopted into a white family. And those things scar deeply, and we watched the harm. We're married for 22 years. I watched the harm done to him, and continuing the scarring that continues even now. And we just want the hurting to stop and the healing to start, and that's why we exist. So thank you so much. And what I'd like to do now, if possible, you'll see the contact information on the screen, but I'd really like to hear your questions, and we'll answer as honestly as possible. If we don't know, we're going to tell you that. So thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much, Deb and Kathy. Everyone here, you will be able to ask questions if you want to. You can either put them in the chat and we will ask them to Deb, Kathy, and Amber for you. You can also use the raise hand feature, and then we can unmute you and you can ask your questions that way. But I'm going to kick us off because we actually had a couple questions come through already. So our first one is from Krista Smith, and she wants to know if you have any book recommendations for parents of young children regarding Indigenous people and Thanksgiving.
In our handout, we actually have a whole listing of resources for children's books. So Kathy, if you could just identify the source, but we're going to attach that handout to this recording. We have a lot of new Indigenous authors that we want to support, right? And the books are the ones that we found were fantastic and listed in one site. So really easy to find, and we'll get that to you.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. We also had a question from Terry Wilkerson, who wants to know, what is your opinion of land acknowledgement statements? If you like them, what elements are important to include to make them meaningful?
Amber, would you like to take that first, or would you like me to take that first?
No, why don't you guys take it? Because I think we have a good answer lined up.
We help faith-based groups. We help any group start a relationship with Indigenous communities by the development of a land acknowledgement. It's a useful tool for relationship building, but it's more than that. When you do a land acknowledgement, you're beginning to communicate the true history, that there's harm done, right? That happened, this genocide occurred. It's a small tool for truth telling, and it's also a small tool for beginning to become aware of what's happening. What we worry about is that oftentimes people will find a similar organization, take their land acknowledgement, a website, or they're using it in their community. The harm from that is that you have lost an opportunity to build a relationship with Indigenous people. The cautionary thing is Indigenous people have been harmed. They have been used up. They're tired. And when we ask someone to assist us, we must be careful not to take them for granted or take advantage of Indigenous people. So when you're building a request, number one, ask, what is your tradition? Do I need to offer you tobacco? Who in your community do I need to speak with? When we're each tribe is different, they have different teachings. So just be careful. Tell them why you're wanting to do this. They want to know that you really mean it and not checking a box off for showing that you're not discriminating, you know. So just they're gonna watch to see if you acknowledgement. And so Amber, I'm gonna be quiet because I could go on for a long time.
Yeah, I had noticed a question come through asking what is tokenism, and what we're talking about there is a token Indian, you know, and you know, now that I've started in this line of study and doing peacemaking work, I will have people who come to me now with questions about, you know, Indigenous topics, and I understand where they're coming from, and I am in a really good position to kind of educate others on that you can't just go to any random Indian and ask your question. You know, if you have a question about a specific tribe, you're going to need to talk to that tribe specifically. And just what I said at the beginning about land acknowledgements is consider who they're really for. You know, you might be disappointed if you go find a tribal person and you want to show them your land acknowledgement and they might not really be interested. And you've got to be okay with that and know what the true purpose of it is. What is it really for?
And I'm just going to add one more thought. I have this beautiful Indigenous elder from Minnesota. She's Mohawk and Taino, and she always reminds me that when you have 10 Indigenous people in a room, you have 10 different opinions, 10 different sets of teachings. So always ask the person that you're talking to, what are your traditions and teachings that I need to honor? Just ask. And I'm going to tell you that we're all human and we're going to make mistakes, and apologize, right? And mean it, and keep moving forward. It takes courage and it takes heart to do this work, and we applaud you for being interested.
All right, Amber, our next question was directed towards you. Claire Donovan asked if there is one current government policy in the works that we could support and lift up.
The library closed.
I do think it's really important to make your opinions known to your elected officials about the ICWA case currently being in review by the Supreme Court. And it kind of goes along with this question that I see from Jean Becker about backlash about teaching what really happened is you're going to have this sort of reverse racism thing that I call it, when the non-Indians are claiming that these policies are discriminating against them. And even though it's feasible to make that argument, you really have to look at the intent, usually the congressional intent behind these policies. And in this country, when people have been wronged by the government, it's actually okay to create policies to try and rectify that, right? So I think that just keeping an eye on the ICWA case and really talking to people about what it means and why we need this for American Indian children is just really, really important. You know, it was before the Indian Child Welfare Act that we had the boarding schools and the adoption project. And even with ICWA, we still have that much higher incidence of Native American children being displaced from their families and just these horrible consequences. So I think that is really important right now, and just the underlying premise of Native American sovereignty in general, and just really questioning, why do Indian tribes have these sort of reduced categories of rights? Why is their sovereignty reduced? Why don't they have jurisdiction over non-Indian people on the reservation? And really the answers to these questions are difficult because it is systemic racism. And I'll just leave it at that.
And may I add just one piece? Kathy and I were in Boston, and we were hanging out with some amazing Indigenous people, and one woman was forcibly removed from her parents. And what happened is, and her communication was really clear. In the first 100 years, after the first 100 years of our ancestors settling in the United States, up to 95% of the Indigenous people they no longer existed. They were killed. After that, the boarding schools, the remaining 5%, were the assimilation effort moved in. And then after the assimilation, forced removal was happening at a high rate. What happens when an Indigenous person is adopted by a white family is they are no longer Indian. They lose all their benefits of being, all their federally given benefits of being a tribal member. This woman lost all her family's land. They no longer had family land. This was in Washington. So these things may seem simple if you don't understand the evolution and the strategy, the genocide strategy, assimilation strategy, and then how do you get Indigenous people to not be Native anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So please don't, none of these cases that Amber talked about are simple. There are a lot of points behind this discussion.
Well, and to take that a step further, when you're talking about losing your rights to the land, a lot of the land that still is a part of the tribal lands and reservations also is where a lot of the people that want to mine to make money is. And so if you can take that land away through these other roundabout ways that people don't even necessarily make those connections with, it's a really sneaky way of doing it.
Yeah, following, and again, the information's out there. We just have to dig for it, and discernment's a huge part. Thank you.
I know we're getting close to our time, but we did have one more question from Ed Peterson, who wants to know, what reparations would you suggest?
I'm going to say that right now. Oh, Amber, good, you're there. All right.
Yep, I'm on the move because my time is up in the Wayne State University Library.
Oh, the life of a student. Yes.
But, I'm kind of on the, more radical end of the spectrum when it comes to reparations. And I am somebody who advocates for land back. And that doesn't mean like a blanket.
So we may have lost you, Amber. So I'm going to pick up your thought because what she said was really important. There you are.
Can you guys hear me?
Now we can.
Yep.
So it doesn't mean exactly returning all of the stolen land to Native Americans. It means upholding the treaty rights that already exist. So stopping the chipping away at treaty rights and stopping the chipping away of the Native American sovereignty. Like, for example, with those that limit tribal jurisdiction over non-Indians. This is a really, really racist rule, and the underpinnings of it are just completely rooted in white supremacy and that manifest destiny. So I think that should always be a part of the conversation, the land back piece, where it's, upholding Indigenous sovereignty and restoring them to their level of sovereignty that they really never gave up, that was just taken from them. I gotta go.
Thank you, Amber. Deb and Kathy, do you guys have time for one last question?
Sure.
Okay. Jennifer Wolf First, she wanted to say thank you, Amber, Deb, and Kathy. She said she appreciated the presentation and suggestions. They're doing a community listen of this land and the repercussions of ICWA. If it falls, and the repercussions of ICWA, if it falls, are frightening as to case law and tribal sovereignty. They are wondering how to show their support, and they will follow your suggestion to start locally.
So I'm just going to say that it's about relationship, and that it is a long and slow and careful and muddy process, because people who are hurting and who have not had the luxury of trusting churches, governments, they're first and foremost, the foundation has to be built on relationships. And I'm just going to tell you today that we've been working with a bishop in the Episcopal Diocese of Northern Michigan who sent a letter out to all of the Indigenous communities saying, we want to understand what you are experiencing. We want to understand our role in the racism. We want to apologize, but we need to know what you're wanting. He got 2 responses today. One from a man who was so angry that he even got contacted by a church. And then the other person said, yes, we would love to meet with you. We would love to have our tribal council sit with you and share this. I really believe that the different responses occurred because of relationship. And I just, to avoid any rough starts, it's about careful relationship building with people you know, neighbors, people who have relationships with Indigenous people, and then moving in to formal and asking, would you like us to speak to your tribal council? Do you need us to speak to anyone other than your team, right? We're doing a peace poll dedication. We had 8 meetings before they said, we think you need to talk to our tribal chair. We said, great, we're on it. And we moved into meeting with their official leaders to say, we're in your community doing this peace poll dedication ceremony, joint planning. And then what would you like from us? How would you like that to go? Who have we not spoken to that we need to speak to? We just, you almost have to go back to asking a lot of questions and building a very careful, slow relationship. I know that's probably a horrible answer when you really want concrete steps, but it's different in every community.
Well, and I would say that in addition to that, it's always following the lead of the Indigenous people. And when you're talking about laws like ICWA, we're so fortunate to have met Amber, who is a law student right now learning about all these things, but your local universities that have Native American studies programs, and they have Indigenous professors that are teaching law, and all of the tribes have their own lawyers and people that are working on these kinds of issues. And that's the place to start, is to find out, because they're the experts and they know what's going on because it's directly affecting their people. And so it's a matter of, okay, what can we do to support that? And how can we use our voices to help with this issue?
And Claire just had when we were talking with our talking points, Indigenous communities have gatherings that are meant for everyone. Go to the powwows, sit, watch, get comfortable. There are things that there are events all the time that are happening, whether it's a screening of a film or a new author that came out with a book. We've got a Michigan author, right? Angela Booley, who wrote Firekeeper's Daughter, great book, Braiding Sweetgrass. There's so many books that help you not only learn the customs of that tribe that they're writing about, but you're building relationship. Buy the books, support those Indigenous authors, right? So just, it's all important work, what you do. It takes courage. Please be courageous and be careful, and just know that we know it works because we're doing it right now, and you're going to make mistakes because you're human, and that's okay. So thank you. We have so much more than just best wishes. It's terrific work that you're doing. Thank you.
Yes, Deb, Kathy, and Amber, we want to thank you guys so much for this informative session. And I think Amber putting together the timeline so we can really understand the policy, its effects, and helping us find direction in going forward. And I will say, as far as the League of Women Voters is concerned, we've taken one positive step in supporting the Line 5, retiring that. And I think I feel really good about the intersection of the League with the Indigenous community on that. So I think that's a real positive beginning for the League of Women Voters in stepping up to the challenges of helping our Indigenous partners in this state. And I hope that all of you will reach out to the League. We have lots of leagues throughout the state that would love to host and lift up some of these issues. So please reach out to us. That's all I have to say. We want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. I think you've been a part of a very special presentation. The fact that Amber was willing to take the time and educate us was really quite a blessing. And Amber, we thank you very much for your professionalism and for taking the time to share with us. Deb and Kathy, thank you very much from the Peace Center. It was a blast getting to know you guys, and I look forward to doing things with you in the future.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you,
And
Claire.
Thank you.
Good and Kathy.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Claire and Ellen. Thank you, Deb and Kathy, and thank you, Amber. Thank you again to our partner, the League of Women Voters of Livingston County, for making this evening possible. Don't forget to visit their website, www.lwv, for League of Women Voters, livingstonco.org, to learn more about the organization and how you can become involved. Thank you all for attending tonight's program. We hope you enjoyed it. Please take a few minutes to tell us what you thought about this program in the short evaluation that was linked in the chat. As Ellen mentioned, our next League of Women Voters and Howell Library Partnership program will be on Tuesday, November 16th at 7 p.m. on Making Democracy Work. You can sign up now at the link I shared in the chat. You can also visit our website, www.howelllibrary.org, to discover more upcoming events from the Howell Carnegie District Library. Again, thank you all and have a good evening.